Welcome in beautiful Maastricht, and hereby I open this academic ceremony in which Teresa Janz will defend the academic thesis Trapped in Poverty, Persistent Poverty in the Context of Global Crisis. May I invite you, Teresa, to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis in 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear supervisors, family and friends. Thank you all for being here today. In the next 15 minutes, I will present the summary of my PhD thesis, Trapped in Poverty, Persistent Poverty in the Context of Global Crises. When I started this PhD in 2020, and in the year in which I developed my research proposal, the state of the world's extreme poverty looked like this. Over the past 30 years, the world had seen remarkable reduction in poverty, particularly due to China. But also, this graph shows that the trends have been uneven across regions. And in the last years, poverty reduction had been slowing, and in some places, even reversing. The COVID pandemic was a shock that pushed millions back into poverty. And other shocks, such as the climate crises or conflicts, are also changing not just how many people are poor, but how poverty works. People are falling back into poverty due to shocks, and repeated shocks can make transitory poverty chronic. In my PhD thesis, I therefore ask, how do global crises influence the persistence of poverty, and what strategies can promote sustainable poverty reduction? I do this in 4 empirical case studies that use different data sources and empirical strategies to analyze this question. My thesis is broadly centered around the notion of a poverty trap, which I define as the socio-economic conditions under which households struggle to escape poverty or are vulnerable to falling back. And I link this concept to 3 external factors that play into this relationship. The first one is urbanization. Typically, urbanization is seen as a driver of poverty reduction because urban areas provide better economic opportunities. But high levels of informality and spatial inequalities in urban areas also sometimes mean that they can promote poverty traps. So in chapter 2 of my thesis, I analyze urban poverty traps in 3 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The second factor are economic and weather shocks. Now, these have different mechanisms, of course, how they influence poverty, but broadly, a shock has negative impacts on labor income, household assets, and savings. And also, if households are affected by a shock, it can lead them to adopt negative coping mechanisms, or the prospect of a shock can make them adopt low-risk activities. As such, economic and weather shocks both can also influence the persistence of poverty. In chapter 3, I use data from Paraguay and analyze long-term poverty and vulnerability transitions. And in chapter 4, I build on that work and analyze the impact of short-term weather shocks on poverty in Paraguay. So now, poverty traps have important implications on how we think about poverty and development. If the poor are unable to move out of poverty on their own, that means that this is a rationale for policy interventions. For example, social protection programs that have been found very effective in reducing poverty on the one hand, but they can also reinforce poverty traps, for example, through adverse incentive effects. In chapter 5 of my thesis, I conduct an impact evaluation of a social assistance program in Jordan, and particularly look at these design effects and how that relates to poverty traps. So, we often think of a poverty trap as a rural issue that occurs in remote, perhaps agricultural communities without access to markets or services. But with high levels of urbanization, and especially when the poor are moving to cities in search for economic opportunities, the nature of poverty is changing. And this demographic megatrend has inspired me to follow the seminal literature on poverty traps and expand it into urban spaces. I use panel data from the World Bank's Living Standard Measurement Study for 3 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, namely Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, which all have large urban populations that are fast growing and thus present great case studies for this question. And I analyze consumption and asset dynamics over time. I'm sorry. The results of this chapter show that while there is no evidence for this classic multi-equilibrium poverty trap, we find that households are converging over time. So there is high consumption growth among the poor. But that is kind of limited around the poverty line. So there's limited mobility around the poverty line, meaning that in urban areas there's still high transitory poverty, and no sustainable poverty reduction is taking place, so to say. And lastly, I also look at the concept of the consumption floor that illustrates the lowest level of material living and find that it has actually not changed much over time, which is an indicator of a poverty trap as well. So this chapter shows evidence for movements into and out of poverty, especially in urban areas. But studies like these are often limited by the time frame in panel data that is rather short, and the limited availability of data generally. So in chapter 3, I addressed this research gap by using 19 years of Paraguay's household survey data and analyze long-term transitions and long-term poverty and vulnerability dynamics in Paraguay over the past 2 decades, and particularly focus on the COVID pandemic and what that has, and how that has influenced poverty transitions. So while these data are actually cross-sectional, I estimate synthetic panels that allows me to track households moving into and out of poverty over time. And the findings show that chronic poverty in the last 2 decades has decreased, as you can see on the slide, both in urban and rural areas, though with differences in terms of the speed and the magnitude. And chronic poverty is now concentrated in rural areas, in agricultural communities, or in communities speaking the country's national indigenous language, Guarani. But at the same time, as chronic poverty has been decreasing, in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, there was hardly any change in the level of chronic poverty. And transitory poverty has increased. So we see that more and more people are moving into poverty. And then I extend this study and use a general measure of downward and upward mobility that includes households above the poverty line and transitions along the income distribution, and also find that especially in the last years, downward mobility has been increasing. So households are still quite vulnerable to shocks. Now, these dynamics and especially the increasing downward mobility that I find in this chapter come at the same time as the weather shocks as a consequence of climate change are increasing in frequency and intensity. So in chapter 4, I build on chapter 3 and analyze the impact of short-term weather shocks on poverty in Paraguay. Paraguay is highly exposed to climate change with a relatively large agricultural population that depends on environmental systems, but also urban populations that live near rivers that are frequently affected by flooding. So I use the same household survey data as from chapter 3 and link it to temperature and precipitation data, where I create weather anomalies. And you can see here on the slide, for example, in 2019, where a drought has happened in Paraguay, that on the left, temperature anomalies were actually quite high, with high temperature, with quite significant temperature shocks and very little rainfall. The findings of this chapter show that weather shocks are indeed poverty multipliers. That means they both increase the poverty headcount and deepen poverty by increasing extreme poverty. There are differences in regional, with regards to the regional regional differences. For example, in urban areas, households are mostly affected by flooding and heat, and in rural areas by flooding and drought. Now, the strong impacts on rural areas, combined with the generally higher poverty rates in those areas, hint at the fact that possibly weather shocks can create poverty traps in rural areas. And again, significant income losses among the non-poor also mean that transitory poverty is increasing once more, and generally we see high levels of downward mobility that makes households very vulnerable to weather shocks. Now, after having analyzed these poverty and vulnerability dynamics, we ask ourselves, how can we address persistent poverty? And one of the answers to this question is social protection. Decades of literature and policy measures for poverty reduction have shown that social protection, and particularly social assistance, can be effective drivers for poverty reduction. One example of a social assistance program is the Unified Cash Transfer Program in Jordan. That is a poverty-targeted, unconditional cash transfer program. And what makes this program even more special is that targeting and registration is largely based on the country's national unified registry, a sort of cross-ministerial register. Last year, I had the privilege to spend 3 months at the National Aid Fund that implements this program, and you can see the building where I worked on the slide. And I was the first person to use these data towards an impact evaluation of the UCT program. I exploited a discontinuity in the eligibility variable given the proxy means test targeting. But I find actually that the program does not have any significant impact or any positive impact on households' income. Actually, it was negative, and also negative in terms of asset accumulation, which I conclude that there's possibly a substitution effect where the program substitutes other income, while there were slightly positive effects on household heads' employment or children's schooling. So ultimately, the program provides a short-term relief, but in its current state and in the current difficult economic times, it's possibly not sufficient to help households embark on a sustainable path out of poverty. And lastly, we also looked at the question of transfer adequacy and conclude that actually the transfers may also be inadequate to trigger meaningful improvements in households' well-being. So, coming back to my research question, how do global crises influence the persistence of poverty, and what strategies can promote sustainable poverty reduction? So my thesis has shown that persistent poverty is somehow characterized by fixed constraints, but also by shocks and volatility. So in research and also in developing poverty reduction strategies, we must focus on transitory poverty and the vulnerable middle as well when designing these policies. Secondly, while poverty traps certainly occur in rural areas, there is also evidence for poverty traps in urban areas. And in my thesis, I find various indicators of poverty traps in urban areas, as well as generally high levels of downward mobility and slow poverty reduction. So next to rural poverty, we must also prioritize urban poverty reduction to make sure that the poor benefit from economic growth as well in these cities. Thirdly, weather shocks are poverty multiplier effects. So when we design poverty reduction strategies, we must integrate climate adaptation into these strategies. And while social assistance provides short-term relief, structural poverty reduction depends on the design. So shock-responsive, scalable, and particularly scalable into urban areas, social protection systems must be built. My thesis has three main contributions. The first one is theoretical, in which I expand the poverty traps literature and introduce a conceptual shift on poverty traps. It has an analytical contribution because I provide analyses of poverty and vulnerability dynamics with innovative methods and data sources. And lastly, and maybe the most important contribution, is practical because I showcase how to leverage administrative data for targeting and impact evaluation of social protection programs through collaborations between academia and the government. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to give the word back to the pro-rector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Monen, Emeritus Professor at Maastricht University and Junior Merit, and Professor Monen was chair of the assessment committee of this thesis, and he's available online, I hope.
Dear candidate, dear candidate,
Yeah, okay.
Let me first congratulate you on a very interesting thesis. I enjoyed reading your thesis. It's clearly written. I particularly liked your discussions at the end of each chapter and the self-criticism concerning the methods you had used and the data you had used. And then you already got one publication out of it, maybe a second one, I don't know. So congratulations on that. I would like to ask you a question on chapter 3. And I'm sorry that I'm starting this round of questions with a very technical question. Namely, the concept of synthetic panels. Let me check whether I understood correctly what you have done. So I refer to equations 3.1 and 3.2 in the text. So first you estimate the relationship between y and x at period t, and then you base this on a cross-section of households in period t. And then you do the same for period t minus 1, and the household that is in the cross-section of t minus 1 is not necessarily in the cross-section of period t. So to compare the two, what you do is you use the estimates of the first period and you apply it to the second period, or vice versa. So in equation 3.2, for instance, you predict what this household that you had in period t, what the y would be in period t minus 1 using the estimate beta hat 1 of the estimate that you got in the other period. So far, so good. It's like adding an additional observation in a period where that observation was not available. But then you also add the residual. And from what I understand, that residual is an average of 100 or 200 randomly picked residuals of the first estimation period. So that means those residuals are not necessarily of that same household anymore. So that adds some noise, in my view, to the way you predict the y. Why didn't you just use the b hat 1 xit? So my first question is my understanding of what you have done correct? And secondly, why didn't you just use the predicted value of y without the residuals?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and for your kind words. Yes, so you understood correctly what I have done. So I take households in the second period, let's say, in period t. I estimate these regressions that you mentioned for these households and separately for households in period t minus 1, because it is a cross-sectional data. We of course don't have observations from, we don't have observations that occur in 2 rounds, or at least I cannot identify whether the same household is interviewed in both rounds. And so yes, I do it backward looking. So let's say from 2020, I then infer estimated or predicted income of that household in the year 2019. Regarding the residuals, so that has to do with the fact that we don't fully know the correlation of the error terms over time. And we kind of estimate bounds, let's say, that are based on two assumptions. So either zero correlation or perfect correlation in the error terms. And that is why I estimate the bounds, basically. Previous studies have also found that the true estimate lies within this bound. And actually, there is also a way in which we can estimate a point estimate of the poverty transition, but that would require quite strong assumptions about the correlation of the error term. So I'm basing myself in this chapter on the method that just estimates the upper and lower bound. I do the 100 draws of residuals so that there's like some sort of, I draw 100 times, so to say, and then take the average of that, so that is robust. You also asked why not just use one residual. So I guess that has to do with the correlation of the error term, that we are not sure what is it exactly, and we draw multiple times so that we have like an approximate estimate. I also want to say that besides the fact that the true estimate usually lies within these bounds, previous studies have also applied the synthetic panel method in settings where there's panel data available, and that has also shown that the estimates are broadly in line with what we would get from panel data. So while it is a bound and it is not perfectly, let's say, not a perfect point estimate, the true estimate lies within that range. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, if I may, Project, I would like to ask a complementary question.
Of course.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, thank you. There would be another way. I would think of another way of doing it. Suppose I don't like econometrics. Maybe you don't believe me. You have your household in period t-1. You don't have it in period t. But you could find in period t a household that is very similar to the household in period t-1, in the sense that it has the same or almost the same characteristics. And actually, you could have households that are, say, on 10 characteristics are similar in 9 of the 10 characteristics. I would say that's a 90% proximity. And you have others that are only 75 or 80% similar. So the idea would be to construct your y in period t as a weighted average of the y's that are very similar, and the weights would be proportional to the proximity. Do you think this would give you something similar, or why wouldn't you like to do this?
Thank you for the follow-up question. So first, I would like to say that with this method, I have followed the literature on synthetic panels, I have adopted the methodology from the literature. So this is also based on a manual, actually, that was written by a PhD student in Amsterdam. Now, I do see what you mean by kind of matching households that are very similar, but the regression models in these equations that you mentioned, they include these kind of parameters, right? The variables, so the household characteristics, let's say those that are time invariant. It's not a matching technique, let's say, but we do estimate a regression based on the predicted income of households that have these characteristics. So I would say that probably doing a matching exercise could be a bit more accurate, as you say, and because we identify households that are really similar. But generally, it is already based on certain characteristics of households who are similar across time periods while not being the same. I hope I have answered your question. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Nielsen, Professor of Public Policy and Development at Maastricht University in UU Merit, and Professor Nielsen was member of the assessment committee of the thesis.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector, respected candidates. I also want to congratulate you with completing a very comprehensive and interesting thesis. I really liked reading it. It uses a variety of methods, topics, and countries of study. But I, of course, also have a number of questions for you. And let me start with chapter 5, where you estimate the impact of a cash transfer program in Jordan using an RDD and match diff and diff design. You find what I think are pretty striking results on income, asset ownership, and labor supply. And I first would like to discuss the income results. So you interpret your negative effects on income as a substitution effect. The income is measured net of the transfer, and indeed, if we look at the baseline summary stats for the treatment group, the transfer more than compensates for the income they had at baseline. However, if this is pure a substitution effect, why would beneficiaries then bother with finding a job at all, especially if the cash they received on average was better than the income that they used to have?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and for your kind words. Yeah, so I agree with you that the results in chapter 5 are quite striking, and that has a lot to do with the data that I'm using for this chapter. So the eligibility variable, or the income that you're probably talking about, is the imputed income that is based on the proxy means test. So this is not really actual income of households, but it's just the outcome of the proxy means test that is used for targeting. So yeah, households might have lower incomes at baseline than their actual, let's say, disposable income in terms of cash, just because the targeting model results in a somewhat different level of imputed income. Now, the problem is also that this data is a cross-ministerial registry. The income data, there's also some data that is pulled from the registry and some data that is given by beneficiaries at the time when they register. So they also do register some sort of reported income. And I have actually found that reported income has decreased over time. But of course, these data come with a number of limitations, one of them being the time frame at which they are updated, and whether all of these updates are immediately reflected, let's say, in the data that I have. Now, why would households invest, let's say, in labor market participation or when they get additional income? I mean, I guess this is kind of like the theoretical framework behind, or like the theory of change behind this program, right? It has the aim to reduce poverty, but also somewhat unofficially, and this is an awkward translation from Arabic, but to make households productive participants in society. So there is no direct component, let's say, that it encourages labor force participation. But of course, that is also the theory of change, that it would free households, let's say, to do that if the economic situation and the labor market situation allows, so to speak. So yeah, households might still invest in labor force participation. And then we also looked at the transfer adequacy, which I mentioned in my presentation. Well, the poverty line in Jordan is 100 JDs per month per person, and the transfer is a maximum of 100 JDs per household per month. So it is an average of, I believe, 18% of the poverty line at the household level. So indeed, while income levels might be very low, we believe that this amount of transfer is really not sufficient, let's say, to trigger sufficiently large or to sufficiently, let's say, compensate income. In a sense, it's a substitution effect for a part of the household income, but not sufficient, let's say, to really make the household go out of business, let's say, and just rely on the transfer. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, thank you. If I can quickly follow up on the labor supply. So the way I interpret your results, but also your interpretation, is that you present this as something good, right? But if you look at the type of labor, so they typically find irregular employment. So I was wondering, do you really think that this is something good? Does that not maybe prevent them in the long run to not be able to search for more stable employment?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, of course, I agree with you that irregular forms of labor are not what we would desire or what we would wish that program kind of promotes. Now, the labor market variables, again, I mean, we have data from 5 rounds within 2 years, so it's quite frequent data, let's say, but especially within informal types of work, it might not necessarily always be very up to date because households might not report that to the registry, let's say. So there might also be labor market decisions that are not really reported. Now we would assume that formal labor force participation is reflected in this data base, and we don't really see that. So yeah, the problem with the informal labor is that in Jordan, labor force participation is generally low, especially among women and youth. The labor supply, the labor demand might not absorb, let's say, the supply. Formal jobs are scarce, I would say. There are efforts by the government actually to make jobs formal. For example, in the COVID pandemic, they made cash assistance to businesses conditional on them registering their employees in the social security system. But formal jobs are generally very limited. So I would say it's probably a constraint of the labor market that households are maybe more able to find informal types of work rather than formal ones.
Okay, thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Lanjou, Professor of Development Economics at the Free University of Amsterdam, and Professor Lanjou was also a member of the assessment committee of the thesis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. And dear candidate, let me start by just commenting on that this is a thesis about poverty, but in fact, it's a very, very rich thesis. I've rarely come across a thesis that looks at so many questions and so many issues. You're looking at Nigeria, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Jordan. You're looking at panel methods, synthetic panel methods, pooled OLS methods, propensity score matching techniques. So a very rich range of different techniques of micro data analysis. And you're looking also at income data, consumption data, asset data, in terms to help you sort of sort out the answer to the various questions that you're interested in. This is quite breathtaking, and I'm very impressed by it. And I also enjoyed very much reading the clarity of the text was tremendous. What I'd like to do, if I may, is drill down a little bit in some of these real building blocks of your analysis. So I wear a different hat alongside my professor hat. I'm also director of the Luxembourg Income Study, which is an organization that's very deeply involved in the harmonization of data. And we grapple a lot with the definition of data and so on. And I was struck in your thesis by a number of choices that you made. And I wanted to just probe how you would feel or how you think that the implications of those choices. So, for example, in the chapter 2, you work with a measure of consumption, but in your footnote, you document how you've removed rental, consumption of rental property out of this measure of consumption. Now, in Ethiopia and in Tanzania, that apparently was not available, but in Nigeria it was, and so you stripped the data, the consumption data of that rental component. It strikes me, particularly in urban areas, that rent and the stream of services that you receive from the occupation of a dwelling might be actually a very important part of overall welfare and may actually be where households might be inclined to spend additional new consumption or incomes on. So I'm just wondering, what do you think might be the implication, particularly with respect to Nigeria, regarding your broader conclusions. You document convergence, but would the possible inclusion of rent in the Nigerian data modify that conclusion? Chapters 3 and 4 work with income. Chapters 3 and 4 work with income, which is my familiarity with Latin American data is very often that these measures of income are very strong on labor income, but relatively weak on self-employment income, and particularly informal subsistence agricultural income, for example. I haven't worked with Paraguay data, but in Brazil, there's a single question of small farmers in their household survey, which is what would be your income last month? Which, if you're thinking about a small-scale farmer, is probably not a terribly meaningful question to be asking, and they don't really know how to answer that question. I'm wondering whether this is an issue that may also have afflicted the data in Paraguay, and therefore might also have influenced some of these conclusions that you've drawn. Turning to I think it was chapter 4 and 5, where you look at asset data. The question I have about the asset data is it seems to have been built up from the ownership of a number of durables and stocks and things that of goods that households have, assets that have. But there seems to be no account whatsoever for liabilities. The households may actually have incurred costs, or they may be borrowing to purchase or to acquire some of these assets. If liabilities had been included, would that affect things? Would that change conclusions? Would the poor look different if you had that kind of information, if you had a richer measure a true measure of net wealth rather than gross wealth? So I wanted to just ask your opinion on the sort of vulnerability or the stability of your conclusions with respect to these basically underpinnings, data underpinnings.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and for your kind words about my thesis. Yes, I agree with you that the data sources have implications on the results and on how we can study these questions. So in the context of Nigeria, you're right that technically rent is a part of the poverty estimate. Of the consumption aggregate, and thus also part of the poverty estimation. So I see your point in actually kind of rerunning the analysis for Nigeria, at least, including that component and seeing whether anything would change. Now, generally, that tells us also a little bit about poverty estimates in urban areas in general, because if we think that in Ethiopia and Tanzania, rent is not a part of the consumption aggregate, that might mean that we largely underestimate poverty in these areas. Now, that has to do with data collection. In Nigeria, actually, rent is also an imputed rent because, of course, not always households don't always register rental income, rental expenditures, sorry. But, of course, I excluded that to kind of make the data comparable across the 3 years, because at the time of writing, I was interested in having a sort of like comparative analysis between these 3 countries. But I do recognize that it would be beneficial to estimate that for Nigeria as well. And I mean, if we think that rental expenditures are quite high and are like a large share of consumption generally, then of course the conclusions would change, because right now we conclude that, okay, households converge, let's say, to a level around the poverty line. That means that some households are moving out. But then if that same pattern, let's say, persisted, it would mean that the equilibrium would of course be below the poverty line, let's say, and that urban households are in fact trapped in poverty. So I do acknowledge that, and thank you for the suggestion to re-include that. Regarding the income data from chapters 3 and 4, so yeah, that is based on Paraguay and Latin America, obviously collecting somewhat more robust data, and income is also the basis for poverty estimations in Paraguay, which is why I relied on this indicator. But of course, income is quite volatile, especially in agricultural communities. Now, Paraguay has a relatively spread out crop cycle, so you have harvest periods throughout the year, meaning that maybe that kind of like evens out some of the volatility in income data. But yeah, it has implications for the poverty measure. Now, especially in chapter 4, let's say, where I include the weather shock, the income data is collected, let's say, just before the summer, but weather shocks might be largest in the summer. So the impacts also on income might be different at different time periods of the year. So yeah, including income, of course, is not perfect for, let's say, for analyzing structural poverty, but in this context, where there's sort of reliable data, at least that is good. And maybe just rerunning parts of these analyses at different time periods of the year would also help, getting better insights into how these dynamics unfold at different times and at different income levels. But of course, in urban areas, for example, we could expect that income is less volatile, so that might be less of an issue in that sense. And then on the assets, so you say that it's mostly based on durables, which is true. Actually, for example, in the context of the Jordan paper and the assets that I used in the PMT targeting model, the assets also have a rural bias because it's largely based on like livestock and crop production and so on. So that not only doesn't reflect, let's say, realities of households in urban areas, but it does include probably some like large components of assets. There is a measure, at least in that context, of financial, I think, stock possession, which of course is like a positive asset and not a liability. But also from previous work that I had done in the context of Jordan, we knew that households often report actually a net debt. They report consumption, but income levels that don't match that at all. So yeah, there are probably high levels of, let's say, liabilities that would have to be factored into this. And perhaps in a revision of the targeting model, or also in a revision of an asset index, let's say, that we would create to analyze this effect, that could be included. I hope I've answered your questions.
I don't know if I have time.
No. maybe we come to a second round, but
Very good.
For the moment I want to continue. So the opposition will be continued by Dr. Moatsos, Assistant Professor of International Economics at Maastricht University, and Dr. Moatsos was also a member of the assessment committee of this thesis.
Thank you, Herr Rector. Dear candidate, let me join the rest of this committee in congratulating you about the breadth and the depth of your thesis and the quality of your thesis. It demonstrates the work that has been done. It demonstrates quality, and it also demonstrates and indicates the potential of the field, and also important work that still needs to be done. Coming from an international economics angle, I will focus more on the international comparability, and the chapter that lends itself for this is chapter 2, where you're comparing Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. And of course, in doing your analysis, you are faced with several choices that you need to make in order to make things also comparable. You do that with respect to the poverty line. You choose to work with a $3.2 a day poverty line, the international poverty line for low middle income countries, provided and estimated by the World Bank, which on the face of it does allow one to be comparable across countries. Now, the idea in creating international comparability is that indeed across countries we are kind of focusing on groups that face more or less or enjoy more or less similar living standards. So the concept of poverty is similar. The World Bank is using the national poverty lines to come up with the international one. And typically, the national poverty lines are either close or quite distant from one another. In particular, in the case of Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, Nigeria had $1.8 a day poverty line, Ethiopia 2, and Tanzania 0.92. How would you defend the choice of actually being able to target similar households of similar living standards characteristics across countries in making your results comparable by sticking with the 3.2 or the $1.9 a day? How would you reflect on the national poverty line versus the international poverty line in this debate?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and your nice words. So as you rightly say, I use the international poverty line for the comparability across countries. And I happen to know a bit more about the context of Nigeria, which actually has a poverty line that is very close to the extreme poverty line of 1.9 that is now updated to 3 actually. So indeed, the poverty line that I'm using is higher than that of the national poverty lines, which I did because I wanted to reflect the living standards in urban areas and the costs of living in urban areas. So if we think that extreme poverty lines and also national poverty lines are often based on a consumption basket of households that largely live in rural areas because they are poorer and the prices that they pay, then that might not really be reflective of the prices in urban areas. So the extreme poverty line I found unsuitable, let's say, for this question, so that I could allow for some more like higher levels of living, even though, as we previously discussed, it doesn't even include rent. But yeah, just to motivate the choice of the higher poverty line. Now, the differences across the countries, I do acknowledge them. Actually, the data also come from different time periods. That might also be one of the, let's say, limitations of this study, that for Nigeria and Tanzania, we have like somewhat more earlier years, and then Ethiopia, the urban sample has only been added into the LSMS study in later years. So yeah, we use PPP, but it might not strictly be comparable in the sense that the time periods are just different, and poverty might have unfolded differently in this time. I also see that in Ethiopia the sample is quite different, let's say, and the results that this paper shows are also quite different. I don't know if you remember that actually the curve or like the equilibrium is at a slightly different point compared to Nigeria and Tanzania, which could mean that the dynamics are different and maybe urban households are more trapped in that in those environments. But it could also just be that the time period and somehow the poverty, the consumption aggregates, play into this. Now, using the national poverty lines, let's say, I decided against, because then the convergence patterns or the poverty trap patterns would have been so dependent on what that country, let's say, defines as their national poverty line that is maybe also not comparable. But given that, they are close, let's say, to the international poverty line, at least in Nigeria and in Tanzania, I would say that it's still useful to do the international comparison based on the PPP aggregate. I hope I answered your question.
May I follow up?
No, given the time, I think I would like to proceed. So maybe afterwards. Sorry for that. So I would like to. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Roelen, Senior Research Fellow in Poverty and Social Protection at the Open University in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I would also like to extend my congratulations on your very impressive PhD. I read it with great interest, not least because you have research in 3 different regions in the world, so it's really a global PhD. And you look at the problem of poverty and poverty dynamics, but also at potential solutions. So I think your work contributes a lot to our empirical understanding, but also our conceptual conversation around poverty dynamics and poverty traps. And I would like to focus my question on the conceptual component of your work. So in your dissertation and the collection of studies within it, you frame your work around the concept of poverty traps, as you also presented. And you find some evidence that confirms the persistence of poverty traps, such as in Paraguay, as a result of weather shocks and the COVID-19 pandemic, and also in Jordan as a result of poor policy design and implementation. But when we look at chapter 2 and your study on the 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you noted there was little evidence for the existence of such traps. And you write that urban poverty is rather fluid and driven by risk, informality, or volatility, and that households just above the poverty line remain vulnerable. Coming back to your findings in Paraguay in chapter 3, although there is evidence for the poverty traps, again, you also find that the analysis emphasizes the importance of considering vulnerability as a separate dimension of poverty, given the considerable transient poverty and generally large share of downward mobility. And then in chapter 4, you also speak to vulnerability, to shocks, and how that affects not only the poorest, but also the vulnerable middle. Now, in your dissertation and in your presentation, you noted how one of the contributions of your work is to push the debate on poverty traps and the conceptualization. And you write that in the scope of poverty traps, we need to look beyond chronic poverty and also look at that issue of vulnerability and transitory poverty. And I agree with that, but it also leaves me with a question about the use of poverty traps in your study overall. So I'd like to ask a twofold question. First of all, knowing what you know now about the empirics of poverty traps across these studies, would you use the concept of poverty traps again? Do you think it is actually applicable or useful in understanding these levels of vulnerabilities, the volatility of households? And second, what are your thoughts on the use of the concept of precarity as a substitute for or a complement to the use of poverty traps as a concept?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and your kind words. Yes, so actually in preparing for today, I also thought a lot about how to reconcile the things that you just mentioned. But I see it in a way that with repeating shocks, or like with an increasing frequency of shocks, chronic poverty and transitory poverty are sort of coexisting at the same time, which they had been before, but it's making it stronger. Like transitory poverty or downward mobility, or however the measure that I have used, is increasing. But at the same time, we also find that chronic poverty still persists. For example, in Paraguay, it has hardly changed actually over the past 10 years. So yeah, while we are somewhat, let's say, effective in reducing chronic poverty, chronic poverty still persists and transitory poverty is increasing. So these kind of integrate a bit more. That is the first, the first answer to this question. And I also wanted to say that in all of the studies, let's say, we also find evidence for this. Like even in chapter 2, in the urban poverty traps in sub-Saharan Africa, there is mobility around the poverty line, but there is also a sticky consumption floor. In chapter 3, where I analyze poverty transitions, and particularly when I look at the conditional transitions, let's say, looking at households who were poor before, what is the probability that they are moving out? The bounds have widened over time. So there is also more movement, let's say, but the upper ceiling has remained the same. So some households are moving up, but others are really left behind in a sense that there is also a sticky share of chronic poverty. So this notion basically that both are coexisting, I think, has kind of come up in multiple chapters in this thesis. Regarding your first question, how useful, let's say, is the concept of poverty traps for analyzing this? In my thesis, I already kind of diverged a little bit from the poverty traps as the S-shaped curve and asset dynamics and so on, and included a bit of a broader angle. And in the definition, I included on purpose, like, what makes households vulnerable to falling back, or how do they struggle to move out? So that kind of includes both the chronic and the transitory poverty part. I probably would use it in the same way. Now we could say that, volatility isn't really a trap. If you're moving in and out, you're not really trapped, because at some point you might move out again. But then if we think that, okay, but if you're moving in, and then another shock comes, and then at some point you're actually trapped in chronic poverty. So in the sense that we include these both angles, I think it's still a useful concept, especially broadened to include these external factors, let's say. And regarding your second question on precarity, I haven't thought about it, obviously, in the context of my thesis, but I think it's a useful concept, particularly also in urban areas, maybe, where we could say that, yeah, the level of consumption may be the one thing, but how does the actual living standard, let's say, reflect their ability to meet the needs, and that can be measured in various ways. But I would say that, yeah, it's a useful concept to basically, build or like illustrate that some households are actually left behind, and not only in monetary terms, maybe, but also multidimensionally. I hope I've answered your question.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Thompson, Associate Professor of Economics at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, it was with great pleasure I read your thesis. As previous members of the opposition have said, this is a very rich and very impressive thesis. I have no doubt that it will add a lot of value, a lot of knowledge, both to the scholarly community and the policy world. Still, I would like to challenge you to discuss with us what we have learned about the really big picture. So you cite in your work researchers such as Art Krij, including his own work and work with McKinsey, several influential papers about poverty traps and about growth and poverty reduction. So Krij and others argue to some extent against the existence of poverty traps, but also, more generally, strongly in favor of economic growth as swamping everything else when it comes to deep, long-run poverty reduction. I would like you to reflect on this in light of your research. So when it comes to really deep, long-run structural poverty reduction, to what extent do you say that the targeting the issues that you address in this thesis, urbanization, weather shocks, policy design, to what extent does this matter for deep, long-run poverty reduction versus, let's say, structural, perhaps institutional forces driving economic growth? And if you have time, I would also like you to reflect on whether there might be interaction effects or effects through multiple channels. So let's say direct effects on poverty reduction from, for instance, cash transfer design, but also indirect and perhaps in the long run more important effects through channels affecting economic growth.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question and your nice words. Yeah, so I started out this thesis with chapter 2, obviously, and where I looked into the seminal literature on poverty traps, amongst others, Krij's work that you have just mentioned. And yeah, he and others, they basically argue, or like they say that poverty traps are rule and that there might not be an existence of poverty traps, but that might also be a lack of evidence for poverty traps. So only because we don't really see these dynamics, it doesn't really mean that households are moving up or that certain, let's say, poverty trap mechanisms don't exist. And so I think what is important also is maybe to look at the mechanisms that drive poverty traps, and I haven't really included this in my thesis, but future work would certainly be to include labor market dynamics and so on to actually see whether the dynamics change, or like whether any of the evidence, let's say, changes when including these drivers, let's say. So long-run poverty reduction, I think, in the context of my thesis, can also, it is based basically on changing the
You may finish your You may finish your sentence,
Yeah.
unless you have finished already.
No? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, my thesis kind of contributes to the evidence on long-run poverty reduction, perhaps particularly in the Paraguay context, where we see that chronic poverty persists. It's really high amongst agricultural communities. We might be able to interact with that kind of in a way by designing policies that change the underlying production functions that make households less, let's say, dependent on environmental systems that are worsening, let's say. So yeah, I would say that there is the thesis does show that long-run poverty exists and some pathways out of that.
Period. That was a long sentence.
Yeah, sorry.
Teresa Janz, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. As you can see, we changed the seats because it was a bit strange that all the women were on that side, all the men were on this side, while we deliberately want to mix. So that's what everybody was noticed already. So we changed that. Doesn't affect the decision. Teresa Janz, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Gassman is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Teresa Janz, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by customs and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Dr. Nieme will continue with the Laudatio.
Dear Teresa, dear family and friends of Teresa, and dear colleagues, it is my great pleasure to be here today and to be delivering this Laudatio, and also on behalf of the supervisory team, on the occasion of this PhD defense. So just a little bit about my experience with Teresa. I met Teresa when she started her master's degree at UNU Merit in 2018. And she was a master's student specializing in social protection. And right from the beginning, I must admit, it was very clear that Teresa was very special. She came from the emerging markets, so she was a student of Guy. And what most impressed me was her inquisitiveness and how she always wanted to examine issues from different directions and different angles. And she was always eager to push her learning one step further. I supervised your master thesis, if you remember, and it was entitled Leaving No One Behind, the Impact of Social Protection Policies on Turkey's Poorest. And the dissertation received an excellent evaluation and you got a 9.2. Now, there's a single very interesting story from the master's years. This is very vivid in my mind, and I always remember it. Probably, I think you know what's coming. So, Teresa came to me, and she said that she would like to build her thesis on a paper that we were working. It was a new paper by Martin Ravalian on the consumption floor. It was a pretty cool idea, a bit complicated. And we were trying to figure out, okay, how would you do it? What would the data? And then I just said to Teresa, why don't you just email him? And for those of you who don't know, Ravalian is pretty, and that's like some years ago, pretty hotshot. He passed away, so may he rest in peace, but he's a pretty hotshot for the world of economics. And Teresa's like, sure, I'm gonna go and email him. So to me, it was really very typical Teresa, open and very brave. And she wrote him, and I think we got a reply probably the next day or something, and we went back and forth, and he discussed the model and some ideas and connected us, and it was a pretty nice experience. But what I really loved in that exchange is that it really showed me how you were. You are very driven, but you are not a presumptuous person. You were very courageous, yet you're very modest. And while you're willing to take risks, you're always very respectful of others' knowledge and experiences. After the master's thesis, you went to UNICEF in Jordan, and you worked on their social policy department. You first interned and became a social protection research fellow. And I think that was an experience that planted the seeds of research questions that would come later. And then you returned to Maastricht. But for me, it was always very clear that Teresa was not thinking about just writing a thesis. She was really thinking about people's lives, justice, and how economics and social policy intersect in the most human terms. So you entered the PhD program at UNU Merit, and you continued your work with creativity and passion. And the path was not always easy, and you yourself confessed that many times. But that is the part that I think was very amazing to see in you, how you confronted these challenges. And you never lost your sense of kindness and your warmth, and also your sense of humor. So let's see if this, there we go. That's technology. Now, for me, one of the joys of supervising Teresa was not only guiding her academically, but also having these wonderful conversations about life and womanhood and experiences and what motivates her. And here I must share a personal story. Now, Teresa, you reminded me of my own roots. You spoke about Jordan, and with much love and passion, that you actually made me fall in love with it again after I had left over 30 years ago. And this is one of your gifts. You observe and you make others observe the beauty of places and ideas and people, and in doing so, you do open the eyes of people around you. During your time in Jordan, you worked with the National Aid Fund, and people there fell in love with Teresa. The fun part was that Teresa it was really our project, so we were never funded by anybody. And then everybody would ask her, so who's funding you? She's like, I'm just here. And they're like, you're just here. So anytime we go back, everybody's asking, when is Miss Teresa coming back? You left a very professional but very kind impression with the people there. They valued your work and your dedication and your respect to the culture, and also to you were always talking to people at face value and never coming as this expert that is going to help them find better solution, but rather work together with them, which is very important. And so I'm very glad that, Jordan has entered into your PhD, and we will be also able to work on it together in the coming years. Now, this ability to span the personal and professional to maintain curiosity is not an easy one, and you do it with ease. So to me, I see you more than a researcher. You're somebody who takes others along with you, and you bring energy to the place around you. And for me also, at a personal level, you have also been an inspiration. So I always say supervisors are meant to help their students, but in your case, the learning went both ways. So when I look at your journey so far, I see someone who is passionately committed, intellectually curious, but also very human. And I would really hope that you keep that, and I know you will. You do rejoice in your work, and you can be very firm. And even if, when pushing back, your face turns very red, and you get very upset, but you don't budge, and you stay firm. And you also welcome always friendship and humor and community. And we could see that in your acknowledgements, which I did not think were cheesy. On the contrary, they were very warm. And they show that someone who never forgets those who assisted along the journey. So I must say, I am really intrigued, though, to learn about the village and the cows, and also what is the big story you mentioned regarding the beer pong World Cups is about. So, and yeah, and I like your deciphering of the RB fighting up the hill, but I think we all know that. So, almost done. So today you defended an excellent thesis, and we learned how poverty traps are not just rural, and they're shaped by shocks. And as was, I'm like confused, as was mentioned, you looked at different places in the world. But in closing, I would like to pay tribute not just to the thesis you defended today, but also for the person behind them. You are a role model, and I know that this defense is not the end of your journey, but is going to be the beginning of many. So Dr. Janz, on behalf of Francisca, Britta, and myself, it has been an honor to accompany you on this journey, first as a student, then as a researcher, and now as a colleague. We are very proud of you and looking forward to seeing what the future brings. For me personally, the joy is also greater because I know we're going to continue working together a bit. And I would also like to extend my warmest congratulations to your family and also to Kai. A PhD is never done alone. And we are grateful for the support and encouragement that has been given along the way. So I think I can speak to all of us today. Then I say congratulations. This is very well deserved, and let's party.
Dear Dr. Janz, also on behalf of Maastricht University and School of Business and Economics, I congratulate you with the degree that you have acquired. And herewith I close this session. For the following, we stay